Have you ever noticed how, like, when you try to, like, untangle a thread or something and you pull on it and it's like, oh my gosh, this is like a whole knot, a whole mess of knots.
Oh, yeah.
That's kind of what it feels like when you start thinking about free speech,
Uh-huh.
especially when you bring in things like radicalization
Mm-hmm.
or just like strong political disagreements.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So we have some fascinating material that really digs into all of this.
Okay, cool.
And it really kind of zeroes in on this tricky question of where does simply expressing support for something,
Right.
maybe even like a protest movement or a cause,
Uh-huh.
where does that potentially become endorsing violence?
Ooh, that's a good question.
So the big question we're going to be like wrestling with today, looking at this text, is where is that line?
Yeah.
Like, where do we actually draw that line? And then once we've kind of maybe figured that out,
Right.
at least for ourselves, then how should we as a society respond to that? You know?
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah. And to like help ground this a little bit, we're going to use the case of Momodou Taal,
Okay.
who's mentioned in our sources, as a way to like really kind of focus in on this. And we'll be exploring a bunch of different facets of this whole thing.
Cool.
Everything from like understanding what certain phrases really mean,
Right.
especially in context, to that really tricky balance between keeping things secure,
Right.
but also protecting freedom of expression.
Yeah, protecting free speech.
Exactly, yeah.
Exactly.
So, I don't know if you want to jump in here, but like one of the things that's really interesting to me right off the bat is just how much of a challenge it is to figure out what people actually mean
Oh, absolutely.
when they say things, especially in these kind of like politically charged situations.
Yeah, it's like, what do these like simple statements, what do they really signify?
Right.
Like you take Talal's social media post, "Glory to the Resistance."
Right.
On the surface, it's like, okay, what does that even mean? It
Yeah.
could be a lot of things.
Yeah.
But then like our source points out, when you think about the fact that he posted that after the October 7th attacks, right, it suddenly takes on this whole other dimension.
Uh-huh.
It's a lot more complex, and maybe even troubling in a way.
Yeah.
Like praising resistance in that specific context without even mentioning the civilian casualties.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, like, what is he actually glorifying here?
Right. What does he really mean by resistance?
Yeah, exactly. And it highlights how subjective interpretation can be, in these really, really charged situations.
Right. And this brings up the whole question of the government's role, doesn't it?
For sure.
I mean, what are they supposed to do,
Yeah.
in these situations?
Mm-hmm.
The source talks about this idea of a responsibility,
Okay.
especially when it comes to people who are here on student visas, foreign nationals,
Yeah.
to make sure that like our campuses aren't becoming breeding grounds for radicalization.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense.
It does make sense on the one hand, right?
Yeah.
But then the source like very quickly turns to this other really important point,
Yeah.
which is the danger of using something like someone's immigration status
Right.
as a way to silence them if they're just disagreeing with government policies.
Right. Just for speaking out.
Yeah, and the source actually uses this phrase, dangerous precedent,
Wow.
if just criticizing the government could get you deported.
Yeah, that's a really slippery slope.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, where does that end?
Yeah.
So building on that idea of like what the government's role is,
Okay.
the source makes this really strong argument for applying standards consistently,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
like across the board.
Uh-huh.
So basically the argument is if students who support groups that use violence,
Right.
if they're going to face consequences like deportation,
Uh-huh.
that same standard should be applied no matter what the ideology is.
Oh, that's interesting. So it doesn't matter if it's like...
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Okay.
And the source uses this really powerful comparison. It says that if we shut down radicalizers who are linked to violent jihadism,
Right.
well, then the same logic should apply to people who are supporting far left or even far right ideologies
Okay.
that also promote violence.
So it's not about the ideology itself.
Exactly. It's the incitement to violence.
The incitement.
Right.
Got it.
So with all of that in mind,
Mm-hmm.
this whole question of what the government should do,
Right.
the source then really emphasizes the importance of this distinction
Okay.
between actually supporting violent groups
Right.
and just expressing political opinions that are unpopular.
Yeah. Okay.
So the text kind of suggests that if there's real evidence that someone is like backing violence,
Yeah.
then yeah, maybe legal action is warranted,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even deportation.
Okay.
But it draws this really firm line at suppressing opinions
Right.
even if they're provocative or offensive.
Even if you don't agree with them.
Yeah, or even if they're just like hateful or,
Yeah.
the source says that that's actually a threat to
Yeah.
democratic values.
Interesting.
If we just shut down people because we don't like what they're saying.
Yeah, because then who gets to decide
Right.
what's okay and what's not?
Yeah, and who's deciding that?
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's a really good point.
So this brings up like a whole other question,
Okay.
which is how do we actually apply these distinctions in real life?
Right. How do we actually do this?
Yeah, like in practice.
Uh-huh.
And the source points out, and rightly so,
Yeah.
that any enforcement has to be fair and it has to be proportional.
Yeah.
And it can't just be applied based on like what's politically convenient at the moment.
Right. So you can't just target certain groups
Exactly.
and not others because you don't like them.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's this huge challenge
It is a huge challenge, yeah.
of how do you make sure that these really sensitive decisions
Uh-huh.
about, what people are saying
Yeah.
and whether or not it's actually supporting violence,
Right.
how do we make sure that those decisions are made objectively?
Right. And fair.
Yeah. Without political bias creeping in.
Yeah, that's really tough.
It is tough.
Yeah.
So to kind of like bring this all together, what we've been looking at here is this incredibly delicate balancing act that the source describes. And it's really the question of how do we protect free speech,
Uh-huh.
but at the same time prevent violence and radicalization.
Yeah. How do you stop the bad stuff?
Right. And the source really highlights this tension
Yeah.
between, on the one hand, governments needing to ensure security,
Right. Of course.
but at the same time, not stifling people who are just, expressing disagreement.
Right. Yeah, just because they have a different opinion.
Yeah. Or criticism.
Yeah.
So that leads us to like this final thought that I think would be really interesting for everyone to consider,
Okay.
which is how can we as societies really guarantee that those laws that we have about speech and association,
Right.
how can we guarantee that they're always applied fairly
Right.
and consistently?
And not politically.
Yeah, and not for political reasons.
Yeah.
Like, how do we actually do that in practice?
That's the question.
It is a big question.
Yeah, it is.
And I think, especially in a world that's as complex as ours is right now,
For sure.
it's a huge challenge to figure out how to differentiate between, what's protected expression,
Right.
even if it makes us uncomfortable,
Uh-huh.
versus something that is actually supporting violence.
Yeah. Where's that line?
Where's that line?
Yeah.
And I think that question really forces us to think deeply about
Yeah.
how do we actually uphold those democratic values that are so important
Yeah.
in these challenging times.
Especially in these challenging times, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot to think about.
it is a lot to think about.
Yeah. But it's good stuff.
It is.
It's important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
Oh, hey. Thanks for having me.
It was really interesting.
Yeah, this is really cool.
Yeah, I always learn a lot when we do these.
Me too.
Yeah, thanks again.
All right. Talk to you later. Okay, bye.
Bye.